Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm super excited about this workshop today because I think it's going to help you get a much clearer understanding of the Common Core standards. And by the end of this workshop, you should be able to look at any question, any ELA question somebody puts in front of you and go, I know exactly what standard that question is assessing. Okay? So I'm excited for you to be able to do that. There's some teachers, not in our network, but there are teachers who can't do that, and you're gonna have a leg up on a lot of people in the field because there are a lot of people who still don't understand the standards. So you should feel good about that. Okay, we're gonna take just 2 minutes, if you would, just on the front. So we're gonna start off with the comprehension process handout. So if you have that in front of you first, at the bottom of that page, if you would kindly just jot your thoughts about this question, what is effective or ineffective about using 10 minutes of tutorial for independent reading of the text? Not dear reading, independent reading of whatever passage you're going to do. And just your own personal thoughts about that, okay? There are 2 packets over there.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yep.
Oh, I'm going to I
There are plenty of answers to this question, so there's not one right or wrong answer here. Just see what you think. If you have an effective answer, try to think of an ineffective answer as well. Try to play devil's advocate on yourself. Your students and how they would handle or how they are handling this idea. Take about 10 more seconds. Okay, if you would pick a partner at your table and tell them, actually the person who's sitting closest to the front, tell them what you thought was effective, and the other person tell what you thought was ineffective.
What I thought
They don't follow through.
Or if they are kids that do it, they rush, they just rush through it. Like, oh, look, I have to do that. It's like the great lines. But I do have some kids who like they focus better and like give them a chance to like just talk for the rest of it. Like maybe they do the reading first and we just talk through it until like, okay, line by line.
Some kids like to have big eyes and they just
Okay, coming back in 3. Dose. Uno. Thank you very much. All right, on your own, if you leaned towards effective, raise your hand.
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
If you lean towards effective, raise your hand. Okay, if you lean towards ineffective, raise your hand. Seems like a kind of split. Okay, all right, so let's get some votes for effective. How or why do you think it might be effective to have students read independently during tutorial for 10 minutes? Mr. Rojas, start us out.
I put down that it puts the scholar in the position to be accountable for their learning, as well as they get to read at their own pace.
Who else? Effective. Go ahead, Miss.
I think it just allows the space for students to be able to think about their own thoughts and reread if they need to reread and just go through more of like
Can you guys hear her?
a learning.
A little louder.
Yeah, it just allows like the space for students to be able to think while they're reading and think about their own ideas and maybe reread if they need to, and just the space to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, tagging off of what Ms. Hubbard said, it's about like, it's a great time for monitored independent reading. So having a tutor there to like make sure that they are staying on track, that if they have like a small question about a word, they can ask that. So it's a really good kind of test practice of like having their own time, but still us watching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What else? Yep.
Sometimes some of my scholars are worried that they're going to ask a stupid question, so at least if they're answering about themselves, they can write that question down without saying it out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Judge for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What else? I would just like to put out there that if they're independently reading, they're reading, which is different from listening to somebody else read out loud to them, which is also known as listening, right? So we have to keep that in mind as well, that students have higher listening comprehension than they have reading comprehension for reasons that are fairly obvious, right? Because you understand words when people are talking to you, but you might see those words on, not you personally, but one might see words in text that they don't recognize and don't know that they actually may have heard the word. That's where we start to see a gap between 3rd and 4th grade, because you go from learning to read to reading to learn. And so if you've heard a lot of words and you've seen words, you start to be able to read more effectively. So having students read independently gives them some more practice at independent reading. What are some challenges to that? Some thoughts about how this might not be effective? I definitely want to hear those as well, because we definitely need to address them. Who had some thoughts about that? Go ahead.
Like a lot of my students, when I do let them read on their own,
Mm-hmm.
they'll either get like super distracted. So like I have scholars who are like more than prepared to sit down for 6 minutes and not like absorb a single word.
Mm-hmm.
So like that can happen and you won't know it, like, because they'll just be looking at the paper.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like an ineffective thing.
Potentially, if they're not doing any annotation, right? It'll be obvious if they're not writing anything that they're not reading. But then what do you do? Right? I think that's a really good point. Yep.
I have a scholar who focuses on reading for the entire 10 minutes, but he'll only get like halfway through the article because he focuses on the details so much. So he has annotation for like every sentence. So I don't think like it's effective because I don't know if they have the reading strategy to be doing that on their own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent point. And put a pin in that, because I completely agree with you. This annotation thing, we're going to start to tackle that more in January. I wish we had time today, we don't, but you're absolutely right about that. Yes?
Kids that we taught in the pros, they mentioned like they can move at their own pace, but paces aren't fast enough sometimes, like especially with the resource kids, or I have like self-contained class kids, they can't read by themselves and keep up. Like maybe even if they're trying, like I have some kids in the self-contained class who are trying, but will only get through like 3 sentences.
Yep.
in the period of time and won't remember it either. So
Right.
like we have to work through it together to make sure that the comprehension happens and that they remember the stuff that they read.
Yep, right, good point. Any other concerns about the effectiveness? Yes, ma'am.
It's a lot of time. It's a lot of kind of like, wasted time in tutorial, where the head could have 10 minutes asking questions to their fellow, getting interactive time with their peers as well. Like, I like to do popcorn reading usually when we do that. So it's the time to like miss on their verbal skills too. So it's a lot of time that they have their heads down all day. So it kind of sucks that them go back and look at that again.
Okay, so your concern is if they're not reading, it's wasted time? Because you don't think it's a waste of time for them to actually read, right?
No, of course not. But I think that like tutorial is a very precious time in space. It's
Okay.
very valuable.
Okay, so you're saying the value of the interaction may outweigh the value of the independent reading time?
Yeah,
Is that right?
essentially, yes.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the popcorn reading, as she said, because then, like, if we're focusing on them reading to learn, then they get two senses. So they get the visual and then they get the auditory, and so students need that. So.
Yep, I don't disagree with you. And just to be clear, I'm not saying they should never read out loud during tutorial. Didn't mean to suggest that to anybody. Just we're floating the idea just to get your thoughts about it around independent reading, because students do need to do more silent independent reading work, and we're kind of wrestling with that. Okay, Ms. McFarland, anything you want to say?
No, I think you guys pretty much covered it.
Okay. All right, great. All right, so let's just put that aside for now. We're going to take a look at the comprehension process staircase. How many people have seen this staircase before? A few people? Okay, great. This is on my website, the Literacy Cookbook. It's on the Comprehension 101 page. And I want to walk you through it because it's really important for people to understand the comprehension process. It's not just reading comprehension, it's listening comprehension, it's visual comprehension. Any comprehension that you do, this is the theory, okay? This is my theory, let me put it to you that way. And I'm going to illustrate it with a simple sentence, and then I'll talk about how it applies in other venues. So here's my sentence. I'm going to ask you to independently read that. Does anybody struggle with that? I don't think so, right? Because you know the man fell down. And so on this chart, what you were able to do instantly is use your prior knowledge about vocabulary and English sentences and do the first step, which is paraphrasing the text. How many people, if I said that same sentence in Greek, could read it? There's usually one in the crowd. No. So if it were in Greek, you wouldn't have enough prior knowledge to do that step. And so you would not comprehend it. But because you know English and you know this vocabulary, you're able to do that first step. So the first step, we do it like so fast we don't even realize we're doing it, is we put it in our own words. Okay? So I like to use strong vocabulary. So for myself, it's he collapsed, because it's the most multisyllabic word I could think of for falling down. So that's what happens in my head. And I'm using my prior knowledge and my vocabulary in order to do that. And then I do the next step. And again, we do this so quickly we don't even realize we're doing it. I ask a question. So I'm going to ask you to whisper to the person next to you. If I said the man fell down, what are some questions that would rush into your head? Okay. Come on back. Okay, so how many people said, why did he fall down, or how did he fall down? All right. How many people said, was he hurt? Well, we have like 4 nice people in the room. How many people said, what color shirt was he wearing? Right, exactly. That would not be a logical question to ask. But we're all right now working with students who might ask that question. Seemingly unrelated question. What color shirt was he wearing? And there are a whole variety of reasons, which I don't have time to go into today, as to why they might ask that question. But keep in mind that if they ask that question, they're not going to really elevate themselves to the next level. If you ask why or how, and in fact on our chart, let's just put a little arrow here. when you ask questions, ideally how and why questions, your next thing is to try to answer them, right? And to explain. So if I said, why did he fall down? I would go back to my prior knowledge and notice it's building as I go. Every time I try to think of something, I build my prior knowledge base some way. And I think about everything I know about falling, which unfortunately is vast. And I think about, all the times I fell down on the basketball court. I used to do Aikido, which is this martial art where you fall down a lot, and I was really good at that part of it. Tripping over shoelaces, falling downstairs. I saw a guy fall down at a football game, he had a seizure. All these things rush through your head, and it happens like this fast, you don't even realize it's happening. And then you get to your explanation, your answer to the question, your inference. So here's my inference. Maybe he was sick. Now, if I said that, right, my friend, tell me your name again?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Holmes is looking at me kind of skeptically like, how do you know he was sick, right? Because you just said that. It sounds like a guess, right? If you don't support your inference with explanation, it is just a guess. So I would have to say, maybe he was sick because healthy people don't just suddenly fall down. Okay? And so if I explain it, I'm getting to the level of inference. Right? I figured out maybe he was sick because healthy people don't just suddenly fall down. And all it said was the man fell down. Okay, great. So now I do what good readers do. I read the next sentence. And the next sentence says, he should have worn those shoes with the Velcro straps. So tell your friend what you just figured out. Okay. Ladies in the corner, what'd you figure out?
He tripped over his shoelaces.
Okay, so how many people said something like that? Okay, but the sentence said the man fell down. Didn't mention shoelaces, so how did you, and then he should have worn the shoes with the Velcro straps. Didn't say anything about shoelaces. How'd you figure that out?
Because if you see Velcro straps, you can't trip over those.
Oh, so you know what Velcro is. But what do our students do when they hit a word they don't know? Nothing to see here, keep it moving, right? Or they just make something up, right? But another thing that they do, and I want you to understand this, it's really important, is they use their prior knowledge. And remember, my prior knowledge was the guy was sick. I just figured that out. So now they're like, oh my God, he's got Velcro. Is that contagious? Is he gonna die? And then they keep reading, and then they're thinking like, why aren't they talking about this poor guy? He needs medicine. He's dying of Velcro, right? And it sounds ridiculous because we know what Velcro is. But if you don't know what Velcro is, just put any other word in there, and you could see how this could happen. And it's like a runaway train. They keep going through the passage going, why doesn't anybody care about this poor guy, right? Now remember, Miss Swan, come on up closer so you can hear. Remember the student who said, what color shirt was he wearing? That kid is like really aggravated because nobody's telling him what color shirt the guy was wearing. And that kid gets really angry, really frustrated, and blurts out, this is stupid! How many people have had that happen in tutorial, where a student says, this is stupid, or this is dumb, something like that, okay? Or this is ridiculous, or whatever, some kind of fill in the blank, this is whatever, but it's an articulation of frustration, and I want us to remember that they don't take it personally, even though sometimes they don't say it respectfully, but they're telling us important information, because what they're telling us is, I feel dumb. I feel stupid. I don't understand what is going on here. I'm confused. And there may be other people around me who are also confused, but who are not brave enough to let everybody else know. So somebody once told me, those kids who give you the most aggravation are like your guardian angels. Because in a way, they're letting you know something that maybe is affecting the whole group, and they're brave enough to speak out about it. So we have to honor that. At the same time, doesn't mean they should be disrespectful to you, and you should talk about, appropriate tone and those kinds of things. But the minute somebody says, that's dumb, this is stupid, whatever, pause and let's go back. You know what, you guys? This is kind of confusing. Let's all own the confusion. It's not on one person. It's not just Mr. Egan who's confused, right? It's all of us. We're all confused. So let's figure out what's confusing about this. And if you think about this staircase, you go back down the staircase. You find out where they got stuck. And if it's the shirt kid, they were asking questions that weren't logical. Maybe because they didn't know how to ask logical questions. Because they didn't know how to ask and answer the 5 W's and H questions. And so if they ask a what color question, what color shirt? That's a what question. That's not a why or how question. You can't get to inference if you don't ask why or how. And if you think about your students' writing, if their writing is very listy and not explanatory, this is what is happening. They are not asking why and how as they read or as they write. When you think about when you're doing your own writing, you're constantly asking yourself why and how and answering those questions with explanations. A what question does not generate an explanation. It results in a fact. What color shirt was he wearing? Yellow. That's not an explanation. So if you don't ask why or how, you don't explain and you don't get to inference. So students who seem like they're very concrete and their writing is very listy, they are stuck here at low tide, paraphrasing. And their comprehension is literal comprehension. It is not inferential because of this. So you may want to make a note on your chart that it's really about how and why questions. So when you're working with students, the more you're able to ask why and how questions, the more you're going to steer them towards inference and explanation. Inference and explanation are two sides of the same coin, if you will. Okay? Now, when we talk about main idea, that's another thing we're going to talk about in a minute. Main idea is not a thing. It's not like you're either good at main idea or you're not. It's an accumulation of inferences. If you look at this staircase, it keeps repeating the process. In order to get to a main idea of a text, whatever it is, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, whatever, you have to draw inferences along the way. And if you miss any inferences, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and you're missing pieces of the puzzle, and you're looking at it, and you're like, I don't know, it could be a Christmas tree, might be a wedding cake, not really sure. I can't get the main idea because I'm missing inferences. So when we look at main idea questions, we have to keep that in mind. Where do we go down the staircase to get to where they got confused? Did they not infer because they didn't ask how and why? Did they not ask questions appropriately? Could they not paraphrase the text? Did they not literally understand the vocabulary in the sentences? Where did they get stuck? So I'm really excited to share this with you so that when you're working with students, you think this way. How can I diagnose what's going on for them in this paragraph? It's not like, well, let me just label them a struggling reader. It's like, let's look at this particular paragraph and figure out what is going on for them. And then we can build from there. Because once you figure it out, you can help them move up that staircase. If you don't figure it out, though, they're just going to kind of be stuck here in paraphrase land. Okay? Anybody have any questions about that? All right, take a moment and whisper to the person next to you anything that surprised you about what I just said. Okay, let's come on back. Now, if you turn the page, okay, so I took the ELA Common Core Standards, and because I'm the queen of cutting and pasting, I put them into different formats. And so what you have in front of you is what I call a trajectory analysis chart of reading literature standard number 1, starting, and then we'll go into other ones. But I want you to take a really close look at this, and I want you to understand what this is, because this is going to be like a really helpful tool for you as we move forward. If you haven't seen this before, each standard has what's called the anchor standard, this thing in italics that's kind of like the headline of what the standard is about. So if you're ever in a position where you're like, I can't remember if this is a standard 1 question or a standard 4 question, you could just go to the, honestly, you could go to the anchor standard in italics and just quickly refresh your memory on what it is. Okay? That's a good cheat sheet for you. Then, as you look down, you'll see each iteration of that standard, each manifestation of that standard, starting with K. So this is the very first reading standard, and you can see it starts with kindergarten, so they get prompting and support to ask and answer questions about key details in the text. You notice first grade, they don't get prompting and support, they have to do it on their own. By the end of first grade, just so we're clear, the standard has to be met by the end of the grade that you're in. Okay, standard number 2, let's put a big star next to this. This is my favorite standard. I know you're not supposed to have favorites, but this is my favorite. Okay? This 5 W's and H standard, if you can't do this, it's really hard to infer. In fact, almost impossible. Why is it so hard to infer if you can't do this standard? Can somebody please explain based on what I just said earlier about comprehension? Yes, ma'am.
Those help you use context clues, all the who, what, where, when, why. You need to understand those to be able to understand the idea of context clues and to develop conclusions.
Okay, that is absolutely true. And can we go back to our chart for a minute and add on a little bit more to that? Why is it so important to the comprehension process? Let me ask the question more clearly. To be able to ask and answer these questions. Mr.
You
Egan.
can make inferences.
Bingo. Okay, remember what I said. You can't make inferences if you don't ask how or why. So we've got to make sure that we're doing that. All right? So this is really critical to the comprehension process, the 2nd grade standard. And I have worked with high school students who can't do this. So I'm telling you, it's 100% likely that you're going to come across students who don't know how to do this when you first meet them. You may still be working with students who don't know how to do this yet, even though we've quote-unquote taught it to them. If you feel as though you're working with students who don't know how to do this yet, spend a little extra time on this with them, because it's really going to help them. If you think about this trajectory as a ladder, you can't skip rungs on this ladder and really build the other skills. So this one is really critical. Okay. 3rd grade, you can see, 4th grade, etc. Okay. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do right now. On your own, I want you to jot, I just jotted notes on the side here, what's different between 2nd grade and 3rd grade. I want you to put down next to 4th grade, what's different between 4th grade and 3rd grade, between 5th grade and 4th grade. What are the differences incrementally as you go up each grade? Just jot notes to yourself on that. Go all the way up to 12 onto the next page. It might help you to underline things that you notice too. go all the way up to 12 so we can see what our ultimate goal is. About 90 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to ask you to compare with your neighbor on standards 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6. What was different between 4th grade and 3rd grade? Talk to your neighbor. Up to 6.
That detail, like you could have like whereas here you would hope that it's blue. And then from 5 to 6, those quotes straight to analysis instead of just explanation. Like, oh, but I know how to work it out. Like I know how to get like instead of even saying, oh, look at this detail, I'm going to explain this detail. Using this detail to help.
We got 2 minutes over there. Just maybe sit over here. Okay, let's come over here. Let's come back. So, what's the difference between 4th grade and 3rd grade? What do you notice in the verbiage that's different, please? Go ahead, Mr. Holmes.
4 has us using the examples from the text.
Yes. And what else? Yeah. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that you don't have to infer until you're done with 4th grade. Just to be clear, you should be doing that once you emerge from the womb. Okay? But it's where you start to get tested on inference. 4th grade. Okay? Good. What about the difference between 4th and 5th? Who's got a thought about that? 4th and 5th. Mr. Holmes is going crazy. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I just wrote quotations, so
Say more.
accurate quotations from the
Okay.
text.
Yeah. So you're not just saying it's in there, but you're giving a quote, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the difference between quote and cite? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Mr. Rojas.
When you're quoting something, you're taking, for example, if I were to quote Shakespeare, I'm just repeating something he said, versus if I were to cite it, I'm explaining where I got it from and who it's from.
Yeah, so you have to use MLA format, okay? So you might want to make a note about that, that by the end of 6th grade, you have to know how to use MLA format. Mr. Gomez, come sit there. And we are actually trying to teach them that in 5th grade, but, were you saying something?
Do they know what text citations yet? Are they supposed to?
We're working on it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good question. Yes, we are working on it. Okay. We are looking. I'm just going to here. Okay. What's the difference between 6th and 7th, Miss Hubbard?
7th is citing several pieces of evidence to support analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. And I forgot to mention, in 6th grade, you saw the word analysis appear. All right, so it gets much more rigorous. And then we've got several pieces. 8th grade, most evidence that most strongly supports. Now again, it's not that we're not working on this in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, but 8th is going to be held really to a much higher standard for that. 9th, between 9th and 8th, what's the difference? What did you notice? Ms. Collier?
The notice of difference was that it's strong and thorough textual evidence now.
Mm-hmm. And then what about 11th and 12th? What's the difference? Go ahead.
It mentions, make sure the students acknowledge the limitations of the text.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you might think about like op-ed pieces that assume that you know certain things about what they're talking about, or maybe they leave certain facts out while they're trying to convince you of an opinion. Anybody here in grad school yet? All right. When you go to grad school, you have to do a search on what's been written on something, and then figure out where there's a gap in the research that you can try to fill in. Okay? So it's kind of like that. All right, great. So that's standard 1. Now, I wanted you to have just a sense of how to do that, and then we're going to kind of quickly flip through the rest of the standards, and then we're going to apply them. So take a look, all right, at standard 2 on page 2. Again, remember I said the anchor standard? If you want to jot a note, this standard 2 is kind of like your main idea standard. And you can see, now one thing I want to point out about standard 2 is we use a lot of materials from Common Lit and News ELA and ReadWorks, and their questions are not always on grade level. So let me explain what I mean by that. We realized pretty recently, can you close that door please? We realized pretty recently that they're asking only anchor level questions. So they'll ask questions like, what's the main idea? That's the anchor standard. But if you're working with 8th graders, turn to page 4. On page 4, Mr. Rojas, can you read 8.2?
Determine a theme or central idea of a text and analyze its development over the course of the text, including its relationship to the characters, setting, and plot. Provide an objective summary of the text.
Okay, notice how different that is from what's the main idea. That's a lot more elevated. So we have to think about asking questions that are more elevated than just what's the main idea. Because on the PARC, otherwise known as NJ SLAY, on ANET, you're going to see questions that actually address that standard and its complexity. So we are trying to be much more mindful in ELA and social studies class that we're asking the grade level questions, okay? Not the anchor standard questions. So that's something to keep in mind. Let's look at standard 3. On page 5. And you'll see if you take a look at this, again, this is the literature standard, but there is a similar, the reading informational text standard has a similar approach in that it's about, you know, interactions of historical figures or events and that kind of thing. And if you notice, you start looking down at 5th grade, compare and contrast. All right, looking at 6th grade, how the plot unfolds, 7th grade, how different elements of a story interact. 8th grade, particular lines of dialogue, how they propel the action. All right, you get an idea about standard 3. Now, I'm taking the time to kind of like review this quickly with you, because what we're going to do next is you're going to look back in your packets for next week and see if you can label the questions by standard. Okay, standard 4 I think we're all really familiar with and the students tend to do really well on. This one has to do with vocabulary, okay? And vocabulary and context, and figurative language, and tone. Standard 5, looking at the structure. We've recently noticed on the bi-weeklies that students are really struggling with this particular standard, and I'm going to be honest with you. Part of the reason they're struggling is because we haven't actually taught this standard very well. And up until about a month or 2 ago, I would drop the words very well. Like, we haven't taught it, honestly. And we realized that when we took the bi-weekly, like, oh, we haven't really worked on this with students. So we've been working on this with students, but it's going to take some time. This is the kind of question where, you know, how does this paragraph contribute to the whole? If you think about it that way. Okay. Standard 6, point of view standard. Standard 7. You know what? I left out standard 7 because it's multimedia. It's about using digital media and compare and contrasting different media. We're not doing that in our packet, so I'm not really worried about that. Standard 8, you're going to notice, if you're really paying close attention, that standard 8 is reading informational text. There is no standard 8 for reading literature. Why not? Because standard 8 is about argument and evidence. And we don't have argument and evidence in literature. It's in informational text. So skip that. Okay? And you'll see the beginning of standard 9, just to get an idea. Standard 9 is about really comparing and contrasting different texts. And we will get into that. We're not going to dwell on it today. But going forward in January, we will be working on preparing for NJ SLAY writing with literary analysis, which is compare and contrast of 2 pieces of literature, and research simulation task, which is compare and contrast usually 3 texts, sometimes 2 texts in a video, but 3 different texts. Okay? So that's where standard 9 is going to come in. Anybody have any questions about anything so far? Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you to take your 5th grade packet for next week. Take that out. questions? Where you get yourself to the multiple choice questions for your 5th grade packet. If you don't have it, just look on with somebody. And if you're not sitting next to somebody, get up and sit next to somebody so you can talk to them, because this is going to be a group thing. Okay. Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask you to spend about 7 minutes as a cluster. So if you're at a table with 6 people, I don't want you to do it as a group of 6. I want you to really try to 3 and 3 or 2, 2, 2, whatever, so that everybody gets a chance to talk. So try to self-separate a little bit so that you can do it together. And what I'd like you to do is see if you can figure out what the standards are for each of these questions. Okay? Talk to your neighbors, wrestle with it, look at the chart, see what you can figure out. Okay? I'm going to come around. If you're not sure and none of you can figure it out, put a big question mark and we'll talk about it. I'm going to give you this for reference.
Oh, this one.
What's at the bottom? Number 1.
let me just say this, there's a lot of overlap, I'm not saying you're wrong, but there's a lot of overlap between reading literature and reading traditional text. And the only place where there's no overlap is in but just because you're reading in traditional text doesn't mean you're balancing between one and the other.
Looking for paragraphs. But now I think 3 because you could so sure they are showing how they made
I think it's both.
oh yeah, because 5 is like
Well, because number. It's just like great idea, summary. Okay, quick timeout. Quick timeout. Just an interruption, timeout. I'm not saying you're supposed to be done right now, just timeout real quick. I need to give you a quick tip. First of all, I was told I had till 4:30. Some people are telling me I have till 3:30. Ms. McFarland says I have till 4. I'm going to split the difference and go till 3:45. Okay? I hope you guys don't mind, but we would miss a big chunk of this if we don't spend 15 more minutes. So just kind of, if you don't mind, okay?
No.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So quick tip though. I didn't go over this, but some people have already noticed that I also gave you another tool that might help, which is park-aligned questions based on the standards. So if you want to cross-check between the standards and these questions, if you're like, I think number 3 is whatever, check this out. It starts with grade 5 and it gives you sample kinds of questions. See if they mirror what you're looking at. Okay, so this is another really good tool. If you're trying to make grade level aligned questions, you can start with this. Okay? I'm going to give you 3 more minutes to solidify your answers with your teammates on what standards each question is addressing. P.S. Some of them may be addressing more than one. If it says, for example, hold on one second. If it says, for example, provide evidence for part A, I'm going to tell you right now, that is standard 1, because it's asking for evidence. However, it's also some other standard, because in order to provide that evidence, you have to meet that other standard. So, think about that. 3 more minutes on the clock.
So what's
Most of them have like 6.1, and then 5.1, and then something else. I agree with most of them.
We got it.
You got all that?
Yeah, like we chose.
So what do you say, Mr. Owens?
What? I thought it was.
I think the question itself is basically asking for more talking about
Okay, so you're saying that this elaboration on the question is articulating the idea and then asking for what sentence. I still think it's scenario one.
Scenario one, when they're talking about the that's
so all you're doing is just comparing this and questions.
So what all right, let's come back. I need my taxi bag. All right. So, some really interesting struggles, challenges, wrestling, debates. So let's have at it. Okay, so let's look at number one. You had to read the statements below, and then you had to answer the question, what two statements are main ideas of the article? All right, so who'd like to start us out? What you think about that one? What standard do you think that is? Anybody feeling lucky? Go ahead, Mr. Holmes, he's always on.
For the first one, I don't know if I'm right, but I think standard 2.
Tell us why.
Why did I choose?
And let's give them a brain match if you agree.
Okay, so they talk about, let me go back to the page.
Okay.
Where I started to. Okay, so scenario 2 basically talks about summarizing in the question. they got it in caps lock. It says main idea.
Uh-huh.
So that's why I chose standard 2.
Okay. How many people agree with Mr. Holmes? Sounds like almost everybody. Anybody disagree with Mr. Holmes? Because I'd like to hear if you do. Okay. So it says main idea in the question, so that is definitely a strong indicator that this is a main idea question, which would be standard 2. So yes, good job. Okay. Question 2 was tricky. I heard 3 different answers, and I want to hear from those 3 different people. And I want you guys to listen, and let's see if we can sort it out. Who would like to start? Do you still think it's number 8? Do you want to make the argument? Tell us your name again.
My name is Miss Hippolyte.
Miss Hippolyte, go ahead. You think it's standard 8, yes?
I think, so standard 8 asks us to evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, including the validity of the reason, and to make sure that there is a sufficient amount of evidence. In number 2, we are asked about just a fact from the reading, so we have to find the evidence to back that up, and it points us to where the evidence is, paragraphs 1 through 6. Yes.
All right. Did anybody else say standard 8? Who wants to jump in and add on or build on or anything?
Wow.
Okay. Now, just to clarify, as I did with Ms. Hippolyte earlier, there's a lot of overlap. The reason I didn't give you the reading informational text standards is because they're pretty much almost identical, except for standard 8, because there is no standard 8 for literature, right? As we said, because there's no argument evidence. So you can assume that there's a lot of overlap. Just because this is a nonfiction text doesn't mean that you can't use, one of the other standards. All right. So we're going to put a pin in that, Ms. Hippolyte, and see, since nobody else wants to follow you down this path.
I know, right?
Let's see. Let's see if we can make a different argument. Mr. Rojas, do you want to make an argument? Nice and loud. Go ahead, Mr. Rojas, loud and proud.
Alright, so I believe that scenario 2, or number 2 rather, thank you. I believe that is standard 2, specifically because if we take a look at standard 2, it says which sentence best summarizes the passage, so on and so forth. So basically pulling out like the main idea of what it is, and I think the question is asking for that.
So it says select the sentence from the section. It doesn't say summarize.
But it says read the introduction, paragraphs 1 through
I'm not trying to slap you down. I'm just saying, when you said summarize, I didn't see that in the question. Hold on. Don't misunderstand me there. I'm just confused because you just said summarize and I didn't see that in the question.
So in the question it says read the introduction, paragraphs 1 through 6.
Yep.
So I'm inclined to believe that it's referring to like the main, like the idea of those 6 paragraphs, and which sentence encompasses the idea of all 6 paragraphs.
Ah. Okay. Now I get your point. McFarland, can you restate what he just said, please?
I really cannot because I didn't hear the last question. But he said something about like it states that you have to like summarize the paragraphs to inform your answer.
Those
Is that what you said?
1 through 6?
Yes.
Okay. And generally, if I may, in starting with paragraph 1, 2-ish, you get some expression of the main idea in the beginning of the passage. Go ahead, McFarland.
Oh, so I thought it was standard number 3.
Oh, wait, so you're going down a different path. Hold on a second. Does anybody else want to add anything to the standard 2 argument? How many people said standard 2? Anybody? Okay, so Team Rojas, standard 2, at least part of Team Rojas. I don't know, it's like Rose. Yeah, that is Rose. Okay. All right, McFarland, you're standard 3? let's do a quick survey. How many people said standard 3? Mr. Holmes, I saw
I
you.
edited it first, but I got the right answer now.
Hold on. Hold on. You know, I know it's Friday, we're getting a little whatever. Okay, let's.
Never mind, I don't wanna.
No. Because I'm not so sure he is right.
Alright.
So let's hear your piece.
Alright, so I said standard number 3 because you have to analyze paragraphs 1 through 6 to determine how the government recognized the Latino history, right? And then, yeah, that was mine. Because it's actually to analyze the paragraphs and able to, like, you know, inform the answer. And how those paragraphs are interacting with each other. Leads us to understand the efforts of the government, the U.S. government.
Okay. Anybody else say standard 3? Okay, Mr. Holmes, tell us what you think is the right answer now.
All right. I had 3 at first. I thought that was good, but I chose 4 because it says interpret words and phrases.
Okay.
And with this, it's telling us to choose a sentence to like identify which event is happening. So they also say give connotative and figurative meanings to analyze how specific something is going on. And right here they're talking about the Latino historical event. So I kind of got lost what I was about to say.
Okay. So I think I hear where you're coming from in that you're asking about the phrasing, and maybe the question is asking about the phrasing. Just to clarify standard 4, standard 4 is like, what does this word mean in this context? Or what does this phrase mean in this context? Or what can you say about the tone of this phrasing? So I don't think this question is actually doing that. So I think we can, unfortunately, we're going to have to X that one out.
Growing moment.
I still, yeah, go ahead.
So, well, I do stand with Rojas.
Okay.
I think most of it's standard 1. Because he said, once it says read closely, determine what the text says explicitly, and make logical inferences from it.
Yep.
So the question is giving us inference to select a sentence from the section shows how the U.S. government has made an effort to recognize Latino historical sites in the past, and the answer is a direct quote from the article.
How many people agree with Mr. Tell me your name again.
Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown. How many people agree with Mr. Brown?
I'm gonna go with it.
All right, so we got more people going with Mr. Brown. Now again, it can be
Still good every time.
It can be more than one. I think Mr. Drown just made a really compelling argument for that interpretation. I mean, I also think Mr. Rojas' point was really strong because the whole passage, this is the key, the whole passage, right, is about these sites, right? So from that standpoint, the phrasing, how the U.S. government has made an effort to recognize, is kind of a main idea. And it's saying, give me a sentence that shows this main idea. So it's kind of a main idea question. But it's also kind of a, give me